Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Well, welcome everyone. I'm Gary Fields, and I have been asked to open the opening session with a few welcoming remarks. I am the coordinator of the IZA program on labor and development, and that is IZA is one of the co-organizers of this conference, along with the World Bank, UNU-WIDER, and the Network on Jobs and Development. These conferences have been running almost annually for the last 15 years and have become one of the leading focal points for people who are working on the jobs issue in the context of developing countries. This year we will have a packed program with, I believe, 48 presenters, a panel, and 2 keynote speakers. The keynote speakers are very eminent economists, Danny Roderick from Harvard and David Autor from MIT. They will be speaking tomorrow and Friday. The conference aims to get researchers to present their work, to share it with others, and for all of us to advance the field forward. I'm looking forward to learning a great deal, as I have in 15 of these conferences, and I welcome everyone, and I turn the floor over to the next speaker.
Piotr, are you online? I think we're missing one of the co-hosts here, but let me then carry on while we wait to hear from Piotr Lewandowski. So I'm Kunal Sen, the director of UNU-WIDER, and also a research fellow in IZA. But for those of you who don't know, UNU-WIDER is a part research institution, part think tank, part UN agency based in Helsinki, Finland. What I wanted to do is give you a bird's eye view of the conference program. Gary's already mentioned a couple of highlights. So we have 8 sessions over these 3 days, almost all starting around 3 o'clock CET. And we have 49 papers that were selected through a very competitive process over these 3 days. In addition, we have 2 keynote lectures. Gary mentioned their names. The first by Danny Roderick tomorrow at 1500 CET. So you've got to work out what that might be in your own time zone. And the second by David Autor on Friday, 3rd September, 1600 CET, Central European Time. In addition, we have 2 special sessions. We're really excited to have these 2 sessions because they're very policy focused. The first is a policy panel on migration for Latin America and the Caribbean, drivers and policy responses, that has been put together, organized by the World Bank. And second, just following that session is another really exciting session, a really important session for this particular discussion on jobs, is a session organized by the World Bank and the ILO on measuring women's and men's work. That will happen just after the migration policy panel. It'll be at 1600 CET. So I hope you enjoy the conference, and I really would like to see we would like to see active participation in the Q&A. That's really important. And all those who are presenting papers will look forward to that. So let's have a really exciting and vibrant conference, and really look forward to discussions going forward. Thank you.
Hello everyone, Piotr Lewandowski. I'm sorry for not speaking in my order, but I had some audio problems. I hope you can hear me. I hope you can hear me now. So I would like to welcome everyone on behalf of the NGD, of Network for Jobs and Development, which is a coalition of four research institutes from around the world. Institute for Emerging Market Studies at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, Development Policy Research Unit at the University of Cape Town, ICRER in India, and IBS in Warsaw, Poland, which I'm the president of. It's the 5th conference, and let me tell you briefly about the selection process. This year we have about 50 speakers selected from the general call for papers. It's a lower number than we used to have last year or 2 years ago, because we decided that we want a leaner conference where it's a little bit shorter, so that everybody can join and enjoy without the feeling that it's overburdening and it's too long. Importantly, we don't have any parallel sessions because we want to everybody have opportunity to see all the talks. This year we received about 200 submissions, so the selection was pretty tough. The acceptance rate was about 25%, as you can imagine. All the papers were reviewed by 2 reviewers. We basically share these duties by 4 organizing partners to ensure that the selection process is as just and as fair as possible. And we're really proud that this conference strives to be a global event, and we do believe that we achieved that this year. Among the 200 submissions that we get, there were speakers or applicants from 50 countries that cover all continents, including Australia. And among the accepted, we have speakers from 22 countries that cover all continents except Australia. But Australia, I mean, the timing of the conference, it's not too convenient for the Aussies. So hopefully next year when we go back, hopefully we go back to the in-person format, we'll have a truly global event. So that's it. I leave it to Federica now.
Yes, hello. My name is Federica Saliola. I'm a lead economist in the jobs group, and it's my great pleasure to join Gary, Kunal, and Piotr in welcoming all of you to the 5th Annual Jobs and Development Conference. On behalf of the World Bank, of our Global Director, Mika Rutkowski, and the Jobs Group Manager, Ian Walker, I would really like to convey how pleased we are this year with the quality of the agenda for the conference. Keynote, special session, ordinary sessions, the quality is really great. Now I have two tasks to achieve in my welcoming remarks. The first one is to send a lot of thank yous, and the second one is to remind everyone about the housekeeping rules. So I'll start with the first one. We would really like to thank all of you who submitted papers. We received many, and it was a tough choice to select the ones that will be presented. So we wanted to apologize to those who were not selected, but it was a highly competitive process. I would also like to thank everyone who has registered. And above all, I would like to thank the supporting team who's made this event possible and put it together one more time. So allow me to mention their names and to read them. So it's my colleagues Yolaina Montova, Javier Sanchez Riaza, Sonia Madvani, Ankit Grover, and Elizabeth Wetter from the World Bank. Then I would also like to thank from IBS Susanna Kovalik and Dominic Spiza from ISA, and also of course our organizer committee, Gary Fields, Ian Walker, and Kunal Sen and Piotr Lewandowski. I hope I pronounce your last name correctly, Piotr. And then I'll just close by reminding everyone the housekeeping rules, which are: please set your microphone mute and only unmute at the time of your presentation. It is noisy, and it becomes difficult if we have to unmute people and find out who is talking. Please, we ask you to keep your videos off if you're not presented, given connectivity problems. We also ask you to post your questions and comments in the chat box. The chair will read the comments, will follow up on them, and will organize them. We also ask if you have any specific question, feel free to contact the host of the co-host. your questions will be directed to the right person. And finally, when you leave the session, please do not hit end the event, but just leave the event. So with that, welcome again. Looking forward to the discussion over the next 3 days. And I would assume I give the floor back to Gary. Thank you.
I think that what we're supposed to do at this point is move on to the first session. It's supposed to begin 4 minutes from now. So should we take a 4-minute break and then have the chair of that session resume 4 minutes from now? Why don't okay, I declare that we do that. Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thanks, Gary. So we just have 3 minutes just for everyone to take a breather, and we will start the session bang on time. Thank you very much. Okay, good afternoon, at least where I am. Happy to welcome you to the first session of the conference, which is focusing on on the question of gender and labor markets. We have a packed session with 7 excellent presentations with authors based from East Asia, all the way across Italy, Germany, and to the United States. So it's a global session indeed. We already have been told what the House rules are, so I won't waste too much time. Just very quickly, 7 to 8 minutes for each presentation. after which, if there's any clarificatory or specific questions in the chat, I will ask them directly to the presenter. And then we hopefully will have around 10 minutes toward the end for other questions. Please put your questions in the chat so that I can direct them to the individuals concerned. I won't introduce individuals right now, but only at the beginning because we have 7. I'd like to start with our first presenter, who is Josh Merfeld at the KDI School of Public Policy and Management, and also an affiliate of IZADE. Josh, please take the floor. My video will come back on at 7 minutes, and then I'll interrupt you in about 8 minutes. Okay. Good luck.
Great. All right. Can everyone see me, hear me, and see my presentation?
You're in presenter view. You may
Oops.
need to swap the
Yep.
slides.
It was, of course, working fine just a second ago. Try that again. Okay. All right. Now it's the wrong size. Sorry, everybody. Get this figured out. All right. I think this is right now. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, everybody. Thanks for having me. My name is Josh Merfeld. I am an assistant professor at the KDI School of Public Policy and Management, which is a policy school in South Korea. I'm going to present some work today with David Newhouse and Michael Weber, who are both at the World Bank, as well as Partha Lahiri, who is at the University of Maryland. And what we're trying to do here is we're just trying to basically estimate some labor force statistics in urban Mexico for men and women separately, labor force participation and unemployment specifically. And we're trying to do this at the municipality level, right? And so most surveys are designed to be representative at some aggregate geographic level, right? In the United States, maybe that's a state. In South Korea here, maybe it's a province, it could be a district, could be all sorts of different things. And you can only really make inferences about the population at that level or higher. But what if we want to say something about aggregates below that level? And that's what we're doing here, right? This is what small area estimation does. It combines survey data with auxiliary data to try to improve precision and accuracy at levels below what the actual level of representativeness is of the survey, right? And this auxiliary data can be almost anything that you have. We're going to be using geospatial data today, but if you happen to have household level covariates, for example, you can use those as well. We're looking at Mexico, and in Mexico below the federal government, I'll talk about this in a second, you have several different levels, and we're going to be looking at the municipality, so kind of like cities. And the reason that we're interested in trying to estimate these is that the municipality level is oftentimes the relevant level for a lot of policy recommendations like active labor market programs. And so that's what we're looking at today. So in Mexico, below the federal level, we have the state level. That's where most surveys in Mexico are representative at. The municipality, and then the EGEB. So the EGEB is going to be basically the level at which we're estimating all of our models, and then we're going to aggregate them up to the municipality. And we're going to use 2020 census data, and it's available publicly for urban EGEBs. So we're going to be looking at urban Mexico only, but that's about 80% of the population. So a pretty sizable percentage, but that is a caveat that we are only going to be looking at urban Mexico in this paper. So just to give you a quick sense of what urban Mexico looks like, it's that kind of greenish color. right? And that's 80% of the population, and that's what we're looking at here in this paper. And so the idea is to take the survey data, right, which does have estimates. You can create estimates at the municipality level, even though it's not representative there, and use that survey data, combine it with the auxiliary data to improve the performance at these lower levels of aggregation. So one way to think about it is that the survey data could be something like a prior, and we're going to use this auxiliary data to help create predictions that are going to update that prior. Another way to think about it is that we're gonna let the survey data borrow strength from this auxiliary data. And the auxiliary data that we're using here is mostly geospatial. We have a bunch of stuff that's from satellites like NO2, NDVI, night lights, land cover, estimated population. This is world pop, but we pulled it from Google Earth Engine. You can find a lot of this stuff on Google Earth Engine. Counts for amenities, highway lengths, things like that. One of the things that we think is attractive about using these kind of features is that a lot of them are available across the globe. So it means we can do something very similar in a lot of developing countries, for example. And so we have the census data. And what we're going to be doing is, since we have census data, we know the entire population in these urban AGEBs. So we're going to use that census data to create a pseudo survey. So we ourselves are going to sample from the census, right? The strata are going to be states. So the state is the level at which this is designed to be representative, the way we design the sample. And the clusters are going to be AGEBs. So if you think of two-stage sampling, the strata are the states, and then we're going to be selecting AGEBs as the clusters from within each state separately, sampling proportional to size, the population of each AGEB. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take our sample and we're going to construct direct estimates, which is just straight from the survey. It's not designed to be representative at the municipality level. And we're also going to estimate these small area estimates to see how well we can improve these direct estimates, right? And the key thing that makes this paper actually worth doing is that since we have the census data, we know what the truth is. Well, at least some version of the truth. So we can actually compare our direct estimates to our small area estimates to see how much we are actually improving. Without that truth, we wouldn't actually know if what we're doing is actually improving these estimates or not. But since we have the census data, we can do that. I'm just going to show you two statistics today. Obviously, I've skipped a bunch of the methodology just because of time. We're going to look at absolute deviation, how far in absolute value the estimates for municipalities are from the actual census values, and the standard error, which is going to be a measure of, uncertainty or precision. So let me actually start at the state, because we don't have to do this at the municipality level. The state level, the survey is actually representative at the state level. But nonetheless, the small area estimates are still really improving on these direct estimates, even at the state level where it's representative, right? So the small area estimate is decreasing standard error by more than 30% and decreasing absolute deviation by almost pretty much 50+%. So huge improvement. Let me just show you this one graph, which is the municipality level results. So these orange bubbles are the direct estimates, just straight from the survey, just the averages from the survey. And then the blue bubbles are the small area estimates, and you can see how much closer to that truth, that gray line, that the blue bubbles are on average relative to the orange bubbles. So you can see that adding the auxiliary data to the orange results in the blue, which is really improving our estimates of labor force participation for both men and women in urban Mexico. Very quickly, the actual numbers from the municipality levels, same things, smaller standard errors, smaller absolute deviations. So we do seem to be improving our estimates here by incorporating these auxiliary data. So we can do simulations just to make sure this isn't one lucky or unlucky sample, that this is actually the true pattern, that this is actually improving, and it does. Weighting is really important. I've skipped over a lot of that today, but that's something we're going to look at in the future. How you weight the actual estimation is important. The current iteration doesn't do that well for unemployment. It does better than the direct estimates, though. And then the last thing I really want to say is that, one thing to just look at going forward is whether, not just in the cross section, but whether we can actually use this at all to predict out of sample better. We can create out of sample predictions, but we're really interested in seeing, how well we can really improve out of sample predictions. This is still a work in progress, so we're still working on some technical issues, but at least for now, we think this has the potential to be useful in other contexts, including in developing countries, since a lot of these geospatial features are available across the globe. So thank you. Sorry, it was a bit rushed. Happy to answer any questions that might be out there.
Thank you very much, Josh. Yeah, we just have about 1 minute for questions. I'm not seeing anything yet in the chat. So just a reminder, please do put your questions in the chat. I will take the opportunity then to ask one question. So how scalable is this to other countries? I mean, does it depend on excellent data being available for Mexico, or could you do something in the case of Niger, for instance?
I think that the thing about Mexico that makes this paper possible is just the existence of the census data, so that we can actually test like whether we're improving the estimate. In theory, if you have a survey, so like the LSMS surveys, Niger, I believe, has a couple over the last few years. LSMS surveys, you could conceivably combine them with some of this geospatial data to also improve your estimates, not just at levels of aggregation below representativeness, but also, as I showed you with the state level estimates, you can also improve your estimates for these labor force statistics at the level of representativeness of the survey itself too.
Brilliant. Great. Thank you so much, Josh. We will have some time as well for any additional questions. Thanks. So I'm now going to hand over to our second speaker, Kanika Mahajan, apologies for any mispronunciation, of Ashoka University. Please take the floor, and I'll be starting the timer soon. Thank you.
Thanks for the introduction, Sam. Okay, is my screen visible? Great.
It is visible, yes.
Okay. So the work that I'm presenting today is co-authored with Suga Chaturvedi at ISI Delhi and with Zara Siddiq at University of Bristol. And it's largely motivated by this large literature on the role of gender stereotypes in playing a role in the gender disparities that we see in employment, wages, occupational segregation, not just occupational segregation, but even within the occupation. There are certain disparities that can be explained by these gender stereotypes. For instance, there can be gender differences in willingness to pay for certain job characteristics like flexibility, which has been evaluated within hypothetical choice experiments and RCTs previously. What we do in this paper is to look at the words in job ads, how they're associated with particular gender stereotypes from both the candidate and the employer side, and not just the candidate side, how these stereotypes affect the posted wages on these job platforms, and direct the job search behavior of men and women. And if gender disparities in wages can be partly explained by these differences. So what we do is that we exploit in our context the presence of explicit gender requests on an online job portal in India. So in India, employers can ask or give preference to men or women in the job ads that they post. We then use these job ads to classify words which are being used by employers along with these gender requests into 4 categories of hard skills, soft skills, personality, and flexibility. We then go on to look at what is the impact of each of these categories on the wages, as well as the female applicants' share to each job ad. So broadly, we find that about 8% of the job ads on this portal have an explicit gender preference, of which 4% are for women and 3.5% for men. We find that jobs with an explicit female preference have the lowest advertised wage on the platform. We then use these stated gender preferences to get the implicit association that might exist in job ads that may not actually request explicitly for a man or a woman, but it can contain text which sends hints to the candidate about the possible preference or the kind of job characteristics that can be associated with different gender stereotypes. So we find that if ads contain text which is predictive of an employer's female preference, then it has a significantly lower wage, and it also receives an increased share of female applicants. Further analysis shows that skills and job flexibility related words matter the most for both posted wages and applicant behavior. So for instance, female skills tend to get rewarded less in terms of wages offered, but a greater proportion of female applicant share applies to such jobs. Similarly, male flexibility kind of words, which may include more travel or rotational shifts, they increase the posted wage, but at the same time have a lower proportion of female applicants applying to these jobs. So we use data posted on a job portal in about a year and a half the time period. It has 1.6 lakh jobs with a million active job seekers, making 6 million applicants. They're mostly young job seekers. It's a portal meant for youngsters, and about 35% of women on the portal are the candidates are women. So, but on an average, it has slightly high skill jobs even for the urban labor market of India. So the first thing we do is get the gender preference. Jobs which have a female preference are called F jobs, male preference are called N jobs, and neither or both are called N jobs in our paper. We then classify the job ads into occupations because we want to look at across occupations and within occupations. And for this, we make use of the job titles in these job ads. We use a clustering algorithm, which is basically built on a machine learning technique to bring together job titles which are semantically similar and then classify them into 500 occupation categories. We control for education and experience requirement in a job ad in our analysis. We then use the explicit female or male preference to get what is the probability of making a female request conditional on the job text that appears in the job ad, even for jobs that don't have such a preference explicitly stated. So for instance, what we find is that a job ad which is has high femaleness, if it's more stereotypically female, like beautician, personal secretary. But not only does this exist across occupations, but even within an occupation, we find that femaleness is high for the same job title when, suppose, take a business development executive. Femaleness will be high when it requests communication skills, but maleness will be high when it requests taking initiative or traveling or working through the weekends. So this is the typical kind of job ads that appear on the platform. And even for the same title, we can find words that either contribute more towards femaleness, which is the red highlighted words, the blue highlighted words, and contributing towards maleness, which are the red highlighted words here. So first, let me present the results of how these implicit associations affect posted wages. So we'll concentrate on the N jobs because of the large sample of these jobs and sufficient variability in these measures. And we find that an increased femaleness leads to a decline in the posted wages by about 26%. So femaleness is the probability that goes from 0 to 1. It reduces wages by 26% even within an occupation. The increased maleness also reduces as compared to neutralness. So here the category is neutralness. However, the negative of femaleness is larger than the negative of maleness. And hence, in a way, femaleness is penalized more in the job market as compared to maleness in comparison to the neutral job ads. We then look at how gender mix of applicant pool is affected within an occupation when femaleness increases and when maleness increases. So here the axis is blown up because it's between 0 and 1. But what we find is that if femaleness increases from 0 to 1, the share of female applicants increased by approximately 15%. And similarly, when maleness increases from 0 to 1, the share of male applicants increased by approximately 12%. So even implicit associations affect wages as well as the proportion of female applicants applying to a job. What we then do is we use the frequently occurring words in the job ads which have an explicit gender request and classify them into 4 categories of hard skills, soft skills, personality, and job flexibility. We obtain relevance scores for each word in the job ad, and for this we use an explainable artificial intelligence method called line, which basically tells us what is the contribution of each word towards femaleness and maleness. We then take the difference between the contribution of a given word towards femaleness and maleness, and that is what we call a net score. This net score takes a positive value for, if it contributes more towards female requests, and takes a negative value if it contributes more towards a male request. So these are the typical, and then you just sort these words.
Kanika, sorry to interrupt. You have 1 minute.
Okay, so quickly, we find very gender stereotypical behavior in terms of hard skills, soft skills, personality appearance, as well as job flexibility. We then aggregate these scores at the category level, standardize them, and run these Münster type regressions. And what we find is that female hard skills are penalized in terms of wages, but male skills and other attributes get higher wages. When it comes to female applicant share, females apply more when there's a greater female hard skills being asked for, and they apply less when there is increased male flexibility being asked for. We do a bunch of robustness checks. So to conclude, we find that job ads with high female association typically have words in them which are gender stereotypically female job attributes. They, on an average, offer lower wages, and at the same time, they attract a higher share of female applicants. The critical categories that matter for applicant behavior and the gender wage gap are the hard skills and job flexibility. So there is willingness to pay for certain job attributes, and here are the two important attributes that we find are hard skills and flexibility. Let me stop here.
Great, thank you so much, and apologies for interrupting. Again, no questions are yet appearing on the chat. So let's move. I think it's best to move ahead, and let's hope that some of the questions come up a bit later. So thanks very much for an excellent presentation, Kanika. So moving on, very pleased to introduce Manuel Santos Silva from the University of Münster in Germany. Please, Manuel, do take the floor.
Thank you very much. I don't, oh, no, I see the sharing screen. All right, I hope you can all see it. It's a great pleasure to be presenting here, joint work with my colleagues Manuel, Lee, and Cornell Sen on gender and vulnerable employment in the developing world, evidence from global microdata. So this paper is motivated by the fact that in recent decades, there has been a lot of progress in many dimensions in reducing gender gaps over the developing world, such as educational attainment, health, and political representation. But when it comes to labor market outcomes, the record is a bit more disappointing. So there are still high and very persistent levels of gender segregation by industry and occupation. Female micro-entrepreneurs continue to have lower profits and lower returns to capital than males of similar characteristics, and long-standing social norms in many regions of the globe continue to constrain women's access to opportunities in the labor market. So that's kind of the background. So in this paper, we're going to pick one labor market outcome that we think is highly relevant in a developing country context, which is going to be the ILO's concept of vulnerable employment. And using global microdata, we're going to try to establish some stylized facts on gender patterns of vulnerable employment. So the ILO basically classifies as vulnerable all on account and contributing family workers, okay? Whereas those non-vulnerable would be employers and wage employees. So as data, we're going to use the World Bank's I2D2 database, which is a large collection of harmonized household surveys. And here, for our purposes, we're going to focus on the employed population older than 15 years old from 101 developing countries, whose data we think is of good enough quality. We're going to have surveys from between 1990 and 2017, but for most of the evidence that I will show you here in the interest of time, I will focus on the most recent year available for each country. Okay, so this is maybe the first figure I want to show you is vulnerable employment as a share of total employment for men in the y-axis and for women in the x-axis. And you see this large variation in levels across the globe, but for about 80% of the countries, these are only low and middle income countries, you find that women are more likely to be vulnerable, to be in vulnerable employment than men. On average, this gender gap is about 9 percentage points, but it is larger in Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East and North Africa. We can then explore the micro component of our data set and ask what happens to this gender gap when you condition on standard labor supply characteristics. So as soon as we control for worker and household characteristics like education, age, household composition, and many others, we find that the gender gap is about 7 percentage points, still highly significant and sizable, and it remains at about that level irrespective of whether we add then industry fixed effects, occupation fixed effects, or in the most restricted model, even household fixed effects. So then the next step is to say, okay, do we find some gender differences in the correlates of vulnerable employment? And let me here highlight 2 dimensions which we find to be particularly important, which are marriage and the presence of children in the household. So we find that marriage has a large positive effect, so it pushes women into vulnerable employment, but it has no significant effects for men. When it comes to children, likewise, we find that there are vulnerability increasing effects of the presence of children in the household. The younger the children, the larger is the magnitude. And again, the effects are 2 to 3 times larger for women than they are for men. We can then estimate as well country-specific correlates of vulnerable employment. And here, what we show is the conditional gender gap. So basically, the country-specific estimate of the female dummy. And you see it varies substantially across countries. But again, for about 80% of the countries, this estimate is positive. So there is a gender gap, which is also statistically significant. This gap is lower, smaller in richer countries, and it is larger in countries which have a high fertility rate and which have a large young dependency ratio. All right, we also find, interestingly, that the gender gap is smaller in countries which have more gender egalitarian norms, in particular, gender egalitarian laws, so legal codes, in particularly regulating marriage, parenthood, entrepreneurship, and access to assets. And the last piece of evidence that I want to show you is using the time variation in our database. So here what we do is we try to decompose the change in the share of vulnerable employment for both men and women between the initial of our sample period in 1990 and the end of the period in 2010. And what we see here on the left side, the dark bars show that the share of vulnerable employment has declined over time by about 4 percentage points for both men and women. So the gender gap remained more or less constant. And we find that our model is able to completely explain this change. Okay, so this is all explained by composition effects, by changes in the supply side characteristics of workers over time. We can then zoom in on which variables contribute the most to these composition effects. That's what we do in the right-hand side graph for women, but the results are very similar for males. And what you see is that most of the change is driven by structural change. So this blue bar changing industry composition, but also increases in own education, which is the green bar, and reduced fertility, which would be this children bar, the orange one. So to conclude, we find that across the developing world, there is a conditional gender gap in vulnerable employment, which is very stable at around 7 percentage points. It seems that the experiences of marriage and parenthood or fertility generate an important wedge between the probabilities of being in vulnerable employment between men and women. The gender gap also varies across countries. It is smaller in richer countries with lower fertility rates and more gender egalitarian laws. And since the 1990s, so over the past 3 decades, we find that the usual suspects like rising education, declining fertility, structural change, and urbanization have reduced the share of vulnerable employment. But with the exception of fertility, these effects were more or less similar for both men and women, so they did not really contribute to a reduction of the gender gap. And so what we find is that at the moment, all of the current gender gap is more or less left unexplained. So it's most likely due to things like social norms, about distribution of household responsibilities, or labor demand, or other issues that we cannot capture. Okay, thank you very much, and I'm looking forward for your comments.
Many thanks, Manuel, for keeping on time. There is one clarificatory question which sounds relevant to me. So could you just clarify how vulnerable employment is defined in your study?
Can you still see my slides? Maybe it's easier if I show you.
Sure, we can still see.
Okay, perfect. So it's a definition based on status in employment, right? So the four main categories would be whether you are an employer, a wage or salaried employee, an on-account worker, or a contributing family worker. And the ILO basically defines the last two categories, so on-account workers and contributing family workers, so basically unpaid family workers, as being vulnerable. So that would be the definition. So the two categories in red would take value 1 in our vulnerable employment variable, whereas the two categories in blue will take value 0. Does that answer the question?
Thank you. Yes, I guess the follow-up would be, is this a standard definition, or is this something that you guys are contributing in this study?
No, that would be the standard ILO definition, which has the advantage that it can be comparably measured across household surveys in most countries. So there are other definitions of vulnerability in employment, mainly for rich countries, but they will be based mostly on formal sector wage employees. So there would be things like how sensitive is a job loss to business cycles and other issues of those. But of course, in the developing country, formal sectoral wage employees are a minority. So we would be, if we would use one of those, we couldn't compare over many surveys, and we would be losing most of the workers in the developing world.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I think we'll move now to the next presenter. If I'm correct, that is Vasco Molini from the World Bank. And just let me remind everyone, please do continue to place your questions in the chat. I'm monitoring it, so I will be collating questions at the end of the session. So Vasco, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Can you see my screen?
Very well.
Okay, great. Thank you very much to everybody. So this is a joint paper of some scholars from university and people working at the World Bank. It starts from a very practical question. So basically, when we promote female labor force participation, which is worldwide considered an important policy outcome, it's not that we are missing one piece of information, and it's not that as a side effect, we are promoting an increase in inequality, and I will articulate during the paper all these problems. So that the conclusion of the paper, of course, is yes, there is a chance that we increase inequality. So basically, when we formulate policies to encourage female labor participation, we definitely need to pay attention to the distributional angle and develop policies that mostly target poor women or women, in lower strata of the population, that not automatically are benefited by blanket pro-female labor force participation policies. So the literature about female labor force participation, is not reaching a consensus whether female labor force participation, an increase in female labor force participation increases or decreases inequality. It depends on specific condition of the economy, the state of development of the economy, the culture, many aspects. Okay, so there is evidence from European countries, but also from developing countries. And this paper is the first attempt to put together all these experiences and arrive to a sort of framework that can tell a story about all of them. And basically our story is that can be both, okay, can be pro-inequality and pro-equality, but the truth of the matter is that the relationship is curved, okay? So it is an inverted U shape. And this is the first hypothesis of this paper. So basically, increasing levels of female labor force participation bring first to an increase in inequality through the process of assortative mating. So basically, couples with same levels of education tend to marry. Spouses with similar levels of education tend to marry, and this has an impact on the household income. But at some point, we see a turning point that in the paper we identify for a cluster of countries in Latin America, where we see that increasing female labor force participation has an egalitarian impact, okay, on the income distribution. And then in developed countries, we see different trajectories, and I mean the issue becomes a bit more complicated because, of course, fiscal policies and policies to encourage female labor force participation diverge in different countries. So we have different trajectories. The point is that we can still identify cluster of countries that share common culture, common policies, and so on, that we see behave more or less the same in terms of female labor force participation and inequality. So they have a similar gradient. An interesting part of this paper is that we try to combine a macro analysis using cross-sectional data, aggregate information, with micro analysis. So macro analysis from using Gini index and aggregate levels of female labor force participation by country, and an in-details analysis using labor force surveys, where we look at each country and we try to dissect by deciles the different impact of inequality on, the different impact of female labor force participation to the inequality. Regarding the data, macro data, we take them from PovCalNet and from WDI, World Development Indicators. For the micro analysis, we use income data from the Luxembourg Income Survey, LIS, that covers most of European countries, and we analyze most of European countries. Some countries from developing world, notably Latin American countries, and also some countries from South Asia, notably India. For countries in the MENA region, we don't have information from LIS, and we use the local household budget surveys. The main issue here is that MENA countries don't collect income, so we have to use consumption, which sort of underestimates inequality. So we analyzed in the microanalysis 18 countries. The two models used, and I skip on technicalities, I mean, it's a simple fixed effect panel regression for the macro model, when on the left-hand side we have the Gini index and some other variables. Here, the key concern is showing that the relationship between female labor force participation and Gini is curved, okay? It's an inverted U shape. And all the other variables are sort of controls. While for the micro model, what we do is basically we use the recenter inference function, where on the left-hand side, we have the Gini index or the P90 on P10 and P80 on P20. So these are standard measures for inequality. And on the right-hand side, some determinants of income at household level. And this analysis, as you can see, is done by quintiles, okay? By quintiles and directly on these two measures, P90 and P10 and P80 on P20 for the inequality measures. And the idea is to also find, I mean, putting together all these micro regression we are undertaking in these 18 countries. The idea is to show that this U-shaped relationship is also reproduced. So basically what we expect is that developing countries like India and Latin American countries show a pro-inequality impact of female labor force participation, while part of European countries show a negative impact, so increasing female labor force participation decreases inequality, and few countries in Europe see a similar effect as developing countries, and we will discuss why. So quickly skipping on the methodology, we do some, of course, we try to correct for endogeneity. So the results from the macro model, I hope you can see the picture, but basically what we want to show are two things. First, that the relationship is, if you see the plot, I mean, is curved, okay, and we did various robustness checks, and also that you can identify, as I said before, cluster of countries that have a similar gradient on this macro curve at the country level. So, for example, we see that Middle Eastern countries, South Asian countries are on the very left-hand side of the curve, so low levels of female labor force participation, but still low level of overall inequality. Then Latin American countries, on the other hand, they...
Sorry, Vasco, just if you could wrap up in 1 minute, that would be appreciated. Sorry to interrupt.
The micro model, and I encourage you to see also the results, shows pretty much the same type of result if we use microdata, and we see that the impact is basically similar, okay? For example, India has a very high impact of female labor force participation and inequality, positive, so increases inequality. Scandinavian countries, on the other hand, are extremely egalitarian, and an increase in female labor force participation decreases inequality. The final point in all our discussion is the policies, okay? Provided that our results are robust and we trust our results, it's really important every time we discuss about pro-female labor force participation policies to keep an eye on the distributional impact. And since we are using public money, I mean, it's very much important targeting this money to poorer women. Few examples, rather than building daycares in urban areas, would be probably wiser and inequality reducing, using this money to build daycares in rural areas, or all the policies to sometimes that encourage female labor force participation in formal companies have the drawback of encouraging the participation of women that are already advantaged over other women that are in the formal sector, and so on and so forth. Thank you, Sam. Over.
Great, thanks. And again, apologies for interrupting. There will be opportunities to respond to questions at the end. A technical note, I believe some people are actually putting questions in the chat, but if they are addressed to all attendees, I believe that the panelists, including myself, will not see them. So if possible, please place your question to everybody. I believe that could be a source of the issue that I'm not seeing some of the questions. And apologies, I'm not ignoring anyone by any means. So please continue to place your questions. Those that have been ignored, please feel free to repeat those questions again. Okay, so thanks again to Vasco. I think we should move on, and we will have a chance to look at the questions again at the end. So allow me now to introduce Gayatri Kuwal from the World Bank. Please, Gayatri, take the floor.
Thanks so much, Sam. I'm just, I'll just, okay. All right. Okay, are you able to see my screen? Okay, great. Thanks again. I'll be presenting today some recent work examining the connections between individual wealth and time use using new data from Cambodia. And this is joint work with my colleagues in the Development Data Group at the World Bank, Ardina Hassan Basri, Talib Kilic, and Heather Moylan. So the main motivation for this paper was to better understand how individual wealth and time use are linked. across activities such as paid, unpaid, and leisure areas of leisure activity. Understanding these links is important for targeting broad gender inequalities in time allocation, as well as in accessing economic opportunities. Ownership and control over physical and economic assets, such as residential and non-residential land, financial accounts, mobile phones, vehicles, and other durables, is one important dimension of socioeconomic status. However, for which nationally representative as well as individual level data has typically been limited, particularly in low and middle income contexts. Recent literature in this area, aiming to connect asset ownership with areas of time use, including labor force participation, have presented more localized evidence within specific countries, and not necessarily with nationally representative data, mainly through randomized interventions that examine effects of expanding ownership of a specific asset. So just briefly to talk through some of the channels where assets can affect time use. There is, for example, the potential of raising productivity and income, and widening access to markets and resources, which has been discussed in recent studies. Land can act as collateral, for example, and in the case of agriculture, land can allow greater access to extension services and other services as well. Vehicles, financial accounts, and mobile phones can also lower transaction costs and expand access to markets. There, however, may not necessarily be a connection with economic participation. Greater financial security achieved through asset ownership, such as land or larger physical assets, may reduce the need to work, especially in contexts where more traditional norms persist. Time may also be further invested in maintaining the asset in question. For example, there's a recent work that has looked at land as well as livestock. The key data challenges really center around the lack of reliable individual level data on asset ownership across different subpopulations, which has limited discussions of these issues in the literature. So this includes individual level data that's reliable and also which covers different asset classes, for example. Our paper examines the relatively understudied role of individual asset ownership across different asset classes, as well as alongside other proxies of individual socioeconomic status in the time allocation decisions of men and women. We examined this question within and across households using new national multi-topic survey data from Cambodia, where individual level self-reported data on ownership of a range of different assets was collected alongside data on individuals' daily time use. This analysis that I'll be presenting today does not examine causal effects, but through this work, we aim to offer new evidence on the association between men's and women's time use and their socioeconomic status through wealth as well as other factors. So to describe the data briefly, we use nationally representative data from Cambodia collected in 2019 by the National Institute of Statistics and supported by the World Bank Living Standards and Measurement Study Plus program, or LSMS Plus. This program supports country national statistical offices in collecting intra-household self-reported data following recent international guidance from adult men and women aged 18 and older on a range of different outcomes related to their economic ability to achieve economic opportunities, including labor, asset ownership, and rights. In particular, the assets and time use modules were all self-reported, and the data cover about 1,500 households over 252 enumeration areas. So I'm not sure how clearly this is going to come out, but if you can see the numbers, this is just a table that describes the breakdown of men and women, the share of men and women owning different types of assets across asset classes covered in the survey. This includes mobile phones, financial accounts, vehicles, livestock, as well as non-residential and residential land, where non-residential land was primarily used for agriculture. And what we find here is that there's a relatively, just looking at from the perspective of gender inequalities, that there's relatively balanced shares of men and women who own livestock as well as land. In some cases, women own a higher share, but there are greater inequalities among men and women for assets such as mobile phones, financial accounts, and motorized vehicles, essentially underscoring the need to collect data across these different types of assets. So to go through the key findings briefly, we do find substantial gender inequalities in time use compared to men. Women, for example, spend more than roughly 3 hours a day more in unpaid work, 2 hours a day less in labor market activity, and 20 minutes a day on average less in leisure time. Unpaid work burdens we find are also relatively sticky, even for women who are economically active. So for example, looking at the share of respondents reporting their main activity in unpaid work within the day, this was recorded in 15-minute increments in the data. We find not only that there are substantial gender inequalities in the share of women and men spending time in any unpaid work, but that even among women who are working, for example, in agriculture, which is the orange line, non-farm enterprises, which is the purple line, and wage work, which is the yellow line, they're still spending a very large share of time in unpaid work relative to men. Second, we also find that gender differences in how men and women asset owners allocate their time, some pronounced gender differences. For example, while asset owners among women tend to shift their time away from leisure towards paid work, asset owners among men shift their time away from childcare as opposed to leisure. Actually, instead of saying to leisure, that should be as opposed to, but it reflects the need to look more closely at social norms. We also find that asset ownership has a relatively greater role in explaining time use vis-a-vis competing individual attributes that are often used as proxies for socioeconomic status, including, for example, men's and women's share of household earnings, which has been highlighted in the literature to be highly associated with time spent in activities outside of paid work. We also find that exclusive ownership of assets, which I just showed in the previous table, many assets covered in the data were respondents were asked whether they own them exclusively versus jointly, and that exclusive ownership tends to drive the results. We also find that looking at specific subpopulations is important, which is an advantage that we have with the nationally representative data. Ownership of financial accounts, motorized vehicles, and mobile phones, for example, is associated with less time in unpaid work, and in some cases greater time in paid work, specifically among women in off-farm activities, but not among those in agriculture, revealing some rigidities in time use that could be explored further in methodological work. We also find in sensitivity checks that ownership overall, as opposed to the valuation of these assets, has a greater role in associations with time use. So to go through the empirical approach briefly, we examine how these different asset classes are associated with time use, controlling for other individual household and geographic factors that could be associated with both sets of variables. We conduct two main OLS specifications. First, controlling for individual household.
Sorry to interrupt. There's 1 minute, please.
Oh, okay. Okay. So I'll go through this very quickly. And we do two types of OLS regressions, one controlling for individual household and geographic variables, as well as interview fixed effects, and also household fixed effects regressions to try to account for unobserved variation at the household level. And we do find that the findings across the two tend to be similar. I won't go through this graph because of time, but it really underscores the fact that women are spending less time in paid work and greater time in unpaid work, and the results are driven mainly by women working in agriculture as opposed to off-farm work. And we also run interactions of asset ownership with occupation status because of these connections between time use, asset ownership, and occupation that we find in the data. So just briefly, I will go to this last, this slide here, which reflects the interaction effects among men and women in off-farm work specifically between asset ownership and time use. And what we find is that ownership of mobile phones, financial accounts, and motorized vehicles tends to be negatively associated with unpaid work for women, and in some cases for men as well. Land also has a negative association with men's time use in unpaid work. And we find a broader association across different paid activities with asset ownership as well for women in off-farm work. One thing that's interesting is that women, again, tend to substitute their time away from leisure as reflected by the green box, whereas men are substituting their time away from childcare. So these reflect, again, some entrenched social norms which should be explored further. And different asset classes also have different associations with time use. For example, non-residential land is associated positively with leisure, negatively with paid work for women, and positively with unpaid work for men, which might reflect maintenance of these assets. So interactions with agricultural.
Please, would you mind please wrapping up? Sorry to interrupt.
No worries. So just to finish, the data provide a unique contribution in this regard. The regressions account for both unobserved and observed factors. We conduct several sensitivity checks, and the results underscore the importance of individual disaggregated data at the national level to examine these effects across different subpopulations. Thanks again. Sorry for going over.
No, thank you, and apologies. It's a short format, so it's rather difficult to get into the details in these presentations. Many thanks. That was a very interesting presentation. Let's continue as I aggregate questions as they come through. Just a reminder, if you're posting questions in the chat, please make sure they're not just to attendees because we do not see them. So if possible, choose another option, for example, to the host. We should be able to see them that way. So moving on to the next presentation, the 6th of 7. I'm very pleased to introduce to you Koa Vu. I'm not sure if that's the right pronunciation, from the University of Minnesota. Please, Koa, take the floor.
Can you see my screen? Yeah, perfect. All right, thanks for having me. Today I present a paper with Paul Levy at the University of Minnesota on evaluating the effect of extending the maternity leave on the labor market outcomes of women in Vietnam. So as you all know, like, maternity leave is a huge question in the labor economics literature. However, most existing studies only focus. Most of them come from developed countries, and there are only very few studies on developing countries. And even so, most of these studies focus on mothers' employment. One of the questions that we find remaining, unanswered is whether maternity leave and have any effect on overall, employment or formal employment of women in developing countries. Specifically, you can think about like maternity leave, imposing maternity leave or imposing longer maternity leave can increase the hiring cost for employer, which can decrease the formal employment of women. At the same time, increasing the benefits of formal employment, such as maternity leave, can encourage women to switch from informal employment, which may not cover such benefits, to switch from informal to formal employment. So that sort of create incentive for them to switch. So we expect formal employment of women to increase instead. So we examine these questions in the Vietnam context. So why specifically Vietnam? Vietnam has a very, is considered quite successful in terms of having a very high female labor force participation. Only about less than 10% actually not working, but 70% of women are family unpaid workers. So you can think of that as the vulnerable employment, as the previous presentation has talked about. Unfortunately, this proportion actually shrinking over time, as you can see on the right-hand side graph, and only about 20% of women have formal employment, which is defined as formal contracts with Social Security, and this fraction sort of grows over time. So this places Vietnam in a very nice as a nice case study to kind of study how imposing maternity leave or imposing longer maternity leave affects their formal employment of women. So just give a little bit of context here. The labor law in Vietnam was originally written in 1994, and it was amended a couple of times. And the ones that we are interested in is the 2012, when it basically made these 4 changes. It formalized the right to strike, making it more limited, increases the national holidays by 1, formally defined minimum wages, lowest payment for the simplest work in the company. So most of these apply to all kind of employees. The last one, which is the one that we will evaluate, is the increase of mandated maternity leave from 4 months to 6 months. The key thing to remember here is that social insurance will pay for 100% of the worker's salaries during leave. So this is the key context that might expand some of our results later on. The research design here is pretty simple. We expect that longer maternity leave would affect women who are more likely to consider giving birth. So we apply the standard difference in differences design, where we compare women within the childbearing age, which we define as 25 to 44 standard, to women beyond that age, so 45 to 54. So just to sort of visualize this design, you can see that on the left-hand side graph, we show the woman of the two age group. The dotted line is the control group that we'll base on the comparison on, and then the solid line is the woman in the childbearing age group. Yeah. So you can see that after 2012, there's a sharp increases in terms of formal employment. Sorry, this is formal employment. And then on the right hand side, I just show a graph of men just as a comparison. You can see that you don't see that sort of like widening gap coming from the age 25 to 44. So this is just a standard difference in differences model. One of the key things that we focus here is that our data allow us to control for quite substantial heterogeneity at different levels. So we control for province year fixed effects and province age group fixed effects for different kind of like local labor market outcome, and then local labor market characteristics that TAM invariance. We also control for year-specific cohort trends to kind of allowing for trends of moving out of agriculture among younger workers that have been documented by various studies in Vietnam. So the data we use here is the Vietnam Household Living Standard Survey, the VHSSS. This is biannual. We use the data from 2010 to 2018. The sample that we use is women age 25 to 54, which is sort of like the standard working age. Sample definition, we focus specifically on college, non-college degree, but the results apply to college degree as well. And the main outcome that we're interested in here is formal employment, which is defined as by ILO standard, which is holding a job that comes with wage, salary, and then provides social insurance. So here are the key sort of results that I want you to take home with is that on the left-hand side, these are like the estimates for the treatment effects over time, which is the event study graph. You can see that, after 2012, like the formal employment, this is the difference between the treatment group and the control group. So the difference sort of widened over time, just as you can see, but these are like conditional on a lot of controls. And then on the right-hand side, we're showing that, the proportion of women in agricultural household work sort of decline over time for the treatment group control compared to the control group. So the story here is that there's some switching from agricultural household work, which is unpaid and also informal, meaning that doesn't come with all these benefits, and then there's increase in formal employment. So there's some switching between informal to formal in response to the law. And then this increase is sort of driven by the increase in formal employment of the public sector, as shown on the left-hand side graph, but not in the private sector, which is on the right-hand side graph. So our results that in the paper that we want to show here, we encourage you to kind of read the paper, is that we don't find any effect on not working. So there's no effect, there's no incentive for women from not working at all to entering the labor force. We also don't find effect on non-agricultural household work, and then we don't find effect on monthly income, both in the formal sector, in the informal sector, or in public sector or private sector. So there's no changes in wage at all, but just just switching from agriculture to public employment.
Just an encouragement, please could you wrap up as quickly as possible?
Yeah, so results are robust, different kind of standard checks, like using men of the same age group as control, restricting women with no infants, triple differences, then using birth variation as treatment variable instead. So we find very similar results. The key thing I kind of want to show you here is that we found a very similar study with a very similar setup, which is Uribe et al. In 2019, that evaluating similar changes in Colombia, and found that longer maternity leave actually lower formal employment among women. And the potential differences here is that Vietnam in Vietnam, social insurance pay for 100% of the worker salary. In Colombia, only 30% is paid by social insurance, and the rest is paid by employers. So that might be why there's a huge difference between our study and theirs. And then the new law in Vietnam also coincided with decline in public employment in the last 2 decades, which making it easier for workers to find jobs in the public sector. So that sort of explain why there's an increase in the public sector instead. So that's sort of reconcile the difference between the two studies, and also that it highlights the importance of doing more of this work in different countries to get at what's the effects look like, and is there any heterogeneity as shown in here. All right, I'm done. Thank you.
Wonderful, great, thank you so much. There's one quick question. Well, there's 2 questions, but I'll get to one of them later. So the clarification question is there any reason that you define childbearing age as 25 plus and do not include younger women in this definition?
Oh, yes. So originally it started with 22 and then earlier, but we basically just try to get at the woman that already done with schooling. We in previous draft we included 22 and then earlier than that, but it's sort of trying to get at the standard definition of the working age, so that we won't confuse with any effects of women that might quit school to enter the labor force. But the results are very similar. We included earlier age of women as well.
All right. Okay. So maybe it's a confusion there with childbearing, but you're actually meaning individuals who are unlikely to be in education.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great, thanks. There is another question, we'll get to that later. But for now, let's have the final presentation. I'm very pleased to present Fan Wang from the University of Houston. Please, Fan, take the floor.
Hello. Is the sound working? Thank you. Let me share.
Everything's fine.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present our work on the female labor force participation and distribution of the gender wage gap. We'll be looking at data from Mexico. This work is joint with Sonia and Manuel, and we welcome any comments to us directly or in the chat. So the motivation that we have is, as all of you probably know, there's been a secular increase in the labor force participation of women throughout the world, in many developing countries in particular. We focus on Mexico. Our data is from 1989 to 2014, where the female labor force participation increased by 50%, from 35 to 60 percentage points. And what we want to study is how this change in the labor force participation has had an impact on the wage distribution. So what we will do is we'll look at some data results, and we'll look at some model estimation counterfactual analysis results very briefly in the next set of minutes. So first, in terms of the data, the gender wage gap in Mexico is interestingly different at different parts of the wage distribution. And when we look at overall changes over these 25 years, we see that the gender wage gap hasn't changed much at the mean or the median, but there has been very different movements at the top and at the bottom of the wage distribution. What we find is that basically at the top, the wage gap between men and women declined, but at the bottom, it's widened. Right? And what we think our key insight is perhaps these divergent patterns at the parts of the distribution are related to how substitutable women and men's work are depending on their occupation. And the core idea is if women and men are more substitutable, as more women join the labor force, of course, that increases the supply, right? And if the only thing that's increasing is the supply, that might push women's wage down. However, if the work with men is more substitutable, then maybe male wage could go down as well. So maybe the change on female wage would be relatively less. And of course, at the same time, in addition to the supply side changing, demand for male and female work could be changing as well, right? So these things are going to be counteracting in the equilibrium system. So let's take a look at some visualization of the data. Here we have two charts showing the changes in the wage distribution and change in the participation rate. On top, that's a result from unconditional quantile regression. The x-axis shows you different percentile of the distribution. The y-axis shows you the change in the male over female log earnings ratio over time. And you see at the top of the distribution, the gap has decreased, but at the bottom it has widened. Around the middle, it's relatively staying similar as before. And we do this based on unconditional and conditional quantile analysis and do various checks, and this pattern is fairly stable. For the chart below, you see two lines. The dotted line shows you the labor force participation rate of men, which, as you can imagine, is fairly stable and around 95%, although with a slight decline. For women, however, there's this massive jump that we discussed earlier, which is shown on the left side axis, going from 35% to about 55%. So these are the empirical data patterns. Now, we said we want to drill into this by looking at occupations, right? How do these things look at the occupation level? Look, there are many, many occupations in the world, but we're going to try to summarize them following the literature into three broad categories: abstract, routine, and manual. And there's a large literature describing what kind of jobs are behind these, right? And let's look at these patterns behind each of these occupations. So what we have here in black is the earnings ratio, male over female. And in the dots is the relative supply. So for abstract, you see the relative supply of male over female is going down, meaning the share of the relative number of male and female in this occupation, there's more female over time relatively, right? At the same time, the earnings ratio is going down, so there's less of a male wage premium in some sense, right? But then look at the other two charts for routine and manual work. For these two lines, they're going in opposite directions, right? And so maybe there's something changing in the back about demand and supply, relative demand and supply, that's leading to this relative wage changes, that's making this relative wage in this overall lower wage occupations, which are the routine and manual occupations, making their relative wage to increase in favor of men, but decrease in the case of the abstract occupations. Okay, so these are the empirical facts. What we want to do is put these facts in the context of the model so that we can drill down and decompose what are the key factors that drive these changes that we just saw. And I won't show you any equations. Please go to my website. We have a latest version of our paper released yesterday where we go through very much the great details in how this model works. But briefly, basically, we want to structurally estimate elasticity and demand parameters in an equilibrium model. We want to extend the canonical standard labor models. We want to expand it in two different dimensions. First, on the demand side, we're going to have a standard nested CS structure. Standard meaning nested CS is a standard structure that we use to think about aggregate production. But we're going to innovate by allowing elasticity to vary by abstract, routine, and manual work, both in terms of gender and in terms of skills. So we're going to have overall 11 different elasticity and 11 different share parameters, and these are going to help us understand these changes in labor demand and supply and wages in these different occupations. And then the other innovations, we're going to bring in the supply side. We will not treat the supply as inelastic, which is often done in the context of male labor supply. We want to think about how women are changing their labor participation because of changes in fertility, marital status, appliance availability of things like refrigerators, and also women's legal rights status through the World Bank's Women, Business, and Law Index. And This thing that we're trying to work on here presents an estimation problem because there's a lot of parameters on the demand and supply side and a different nest of the production system. And we go through in great details about how estimation is done, why identification is possible in this equilibrium estimation framework, which I won't show you here. What are our findings? On the elasticity side, one of our key findings is these two broad numbers. One is this number around 2.5, which is the elasticity of substitution for the task-intensive, the more abstract types of categories. So what this means is that men and women are more substitutable if you're thinking about these higher wage, higher skill, but also higher abstract task-intensive jobs. On the other hand, the lower paying manual and routine occupations, in those, men and women are much less substitutable. So this is consistent with increasing female labor force participation, exerting potentially less downward pressure on male to female to male relative wages in the high paying rather than in the low paying occupations. On the demand side, we find that demand trends favored female workers and also educated college workers. And for these categories, the demand increase overwhelmed the increase in supply, and so that's why we saw the reduction in the wage premium there, but the opposite was happening in the lower skill categories and in the manual and routine occupations. Finally, let me show you
1 minute, please.
Yeah, let me show you
Sorry to interrupt.
Thank you. Let me show you a counterfactual chart. So we want to analyze demand supply side, right? So through our model, we're able to look at the key demand supply side factors and see which one matter more for changes in aggregate female labor supply participation rate, the difference between male and female. So here we show general equilibrium and partial equilibrium on the left and on the right. The y-axis here shows you the change, the aggregate change in male minus female participation share. The dashed line is the data. So over time, it decreased by about 25%. If you look at the right-hand side, the partial equilibrium, which is given our supply side model, if we just simulate the model without changing wages, and we put each one of these four factors one at a time at their 1989 level. So to say, if this factor wasn't changing, if it was at its initial level, how would participation gap have differed? What this shows you is appliance plays a very big role. So the blue chart, so if appliance increased, the availability of appliance, which increased tremendously, didn't happen, then you would have seen a much smaller reduction in the gap. And this blue line is largely driven by unskilled women who are very sensitive to these appliance changes. The second biggest factor is women fertility for children under 5. This happens to impact married women. This happens to impact better educated women more. And this is the second most important factor. If this didn't change and was fixed at its initial level, female labor force participation would have gone down, but not as much also. We show partial and general, and this shows the importance of analyzing the equilibrium effects. When you open up the equilibrium channel and allow wages to adjust, then you see all the effects from these four channels are going to be much smaller. Because as more women participate, wages going to get pushed up, and wage is going to get pulled down, and so then less women want to participate, right? So general equilibrium effects is less in magnitudes than the partial, although the directions are overall the same. And so let me wrap up. So overall, what do we find? We do a structural estimation of this equilibrium demand supply model, and we have the findings that I just showed you. So thank you.
Thanks a lot. Very difficult to compress everything into that short time, but thank you. There is one question, Fran, while you're here. A question, are you saying that women's participation has increased due to increased fertility? Is that a factor that you take into account?
Exactly. So we have for skilled women, fertility plays an important role in changing their participation rate based on our finding. But fertility doesn't play as big a role for unskilled women. Appliance availability plays a much bigger role for unskilled women in terms of their aggregate effect, because the overall share of skilled women is less in the economy. So in equilibrium in total aggregate, the total impact of fertility is not as large as the impact of the appliance change. And in terms of the data, appliance availability, as you can imagine, increased dramatically over time, and fertility decreased over time. Right, so it's the decrease in fertility that led to an increase in the participation rate of skilled women in our analysis. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much. Please do continue to place your questions in the chat. I'm now going to go through a couple of questions that have come through. There's actually some similarities across questions on the issue of social norms and social taboos. For instance, and I'll go through one by one. Kanika, for example, the question was, how do social and cultural taboos in the subcontinent influence the job structure, and how might that have an impact? Similarly to Manuel, to what extent could your decomposition include differences in social norms in terms of the gender gap? And similarly to Gayatri, would that be possible as well to take into account these differences in social norms into the model? So Kanika, do you have anything that you'd like to comment on that question about the role of social taboos on job structure, social norms and cultural taboos, sorry.
Okay. I'm sure that social norms would play a role in different country-specific contexts, and they could also affect, what we see for India could be different from, what is observed for, say, the US. Although what we find in terms of the gender stereotypes, they look very similar if you compare some of the literature even on the US. Typical things like negotiation or supervision is something that men are associated with. Even in the literature on the US. So there could be context-specific things with regard to India, but I think a lot of the findings that we see can be generalized to other contexts as well, given the existing literature on social psychology. Did I get the question?
Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Sure, thank you. No, that's great. We don't have a great deal of time. Manuel, do you have any comments on a similar theme? Could social norms be included in your model somehow?
Yes, I think at the country level we probably should try to then correlate kind of the country-specific gender gaps to different measures of social norms. For the estimation of the gender gap itself, we always, we include like admin 1, fixed effects, and we try the most to kind of exclude this type of variation. But of course, yeah, it would be nice to explicitly model gender norms and have some data on that. I completely agree.
Could I add something to this too? So.
Sure.
Yeah, so in our paper, we do use the World Bank's Women in Business Law Index, right? And I think one tricky thing about using that is, unlike the other variables like appliance availability, which could differ by population, skilled and unskilled women, etc., but the WBL index is available at the national level. So it's often not possible to use that to explain sort of subgroup differences, right? And in our analysis, we do find it to matter, and it improves women's participation when that index goes up and makes men's participation go down a little bit, but it doesn't play as big of a factor because one of the main finding is this sort of subgroup differences that we have, right? So it'd be great if there's actually future data that can allow us to see how it differs for women of different subgroups in the country, yeah.
Thank you. I think that's that's a point that's relevant across some of the papers, that social norms with respect to women may well differ across regions of a country, for instance, that might be relevant to take into account. Gayatri, do you have any comments on a similar theme about incorporating questions about social and cultural norms into this kind of analysis?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. I think that what we're finding in the results is clearly points to some rigidities in time use. For example, men substituting their time away from childcare, women substituting their time away from leisure with respect, when it comes to asset owners. From a data collection perspective, I think that understanding more clearly how men and women use specific assets, questions around that would be helpful, as well as potentially more cognitive questions around perceptions of how men's and women's roles in different spheres of activity, whether it's domestic or paid activity. Are there certain roles that men take on that women don't, which is again commonly kind of documented in more focused studies across countries. Within agriculture, for example, there's often a clear division of roles, and within other areas as well. So questions around that would be helpful and more insightful in kind of highlighting some of these channels.
Excellent. Thank you so much. One more quite general question that probably relates to a number of the papers was this point about to what extent should we just focus on male-female differences on aggregate, or is it more relevant to focus on male-female differences across different age categories, for example, young women versus young men? Reaching out to some of the other participants, perhaps Josh, would you have any comments to what extent that those kinds of issues could be incorporated in these small area estimates? I mean, can you drill down to age differences, for example, using your method, and would that be relevant?
So the real issue comes when you try to split the sample more and more, is that your effective sample size gets smaller and smaller. So just talking about the actual empirics of the matter, not even talking about what the actual research question is. The issue we ran into with unemployment is that, so for example, female unemployment, women's labor force participation in Mexico in the census was, I think, around 50%. So if you have a sample of 40 people, labor force participation is 50%. So you get 20 women, half of whom are in the labor force. That's only 10 women. The actual unemployment rate in the entire country for women was something like 3%, 2%. So a bunch of those, clusters have zeros for female unemployment, right? And so that's just if you take all women. So if you then start talking about breaking that up into ages, you're going to get even more of them, right? So, just from a strictly empirically, would this work? I think we'd run into a lot of problems doing it that way. But that doesn't mean that that's not the right way to try to model it, depending on what the research question is you're asking, right? If you just take all women, it's kind of, it obfuscates, it hides the trends for younger women a bit more than it would be if you looked at only younger women, for example.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Vasco, I mean, in your paper, does the issue of differences across age groups, would that be a relevant consideration? Well, I think we may have lost Vasco there. Apologies for that. I mean, same question, I guess, then perhaps we could go back to Kanika. I mean, did you take into account, maybe you can't take into account in these advertisements, can you look into age-related differences, or would that be out of the question?
So these are actually primarily job ads that are targeted towards entry-level college graduates. So these are the younger workers anyways. So our age group that we're looking at are these entry-level jobs. So they're not management level, senior management level jobs that we're looking at in our context. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Thank you. I think, yeah, I mean, it's an important issue to take into consideration in general. So one last question that's in the chat here, and that goes to our last speaker, Fan. Have you considered the effect of migration on the gender composition? That's obviously a relevant question for Mexico.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So in our model, I didn't discuss, but one ingredient in addition to demand supply is two objects, actually. It's the probability of working times the number of potential worker available, right? And in our framework, what we think of is there are 4 types of worker available: male and female, skilled and unskilled. And we get from the data the available number of potential worker in each one of these categories. That number is changing every year due to perhaps changes in migration and other types of factors or just general demographic changes, right? So we, in our paper, we do see what's the effect of demographic changes, but we don't decompose it into how much of it is driven by migration changes versus not. But what we do see is the demographic changes do play an important role, largely, and it's largely a function of how many skilled women will remain in Mexico. It turns out that over time, the skilled women's share increased. It's still small, but it increased, and that had a lot to do, and that had a big impact on wage distribution. And to what extent migration was impacting that, we did not analyze that. But that's a great question that we should investigate more. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So unfortunately, time has now run out. It's 3:45 according to the Central European time. So we now have just a short break, 15 minutes, until the next panel, which is, that's good. It's on migration. So we're continuing this theme. So let me just wrap up by saying thank you to all the presenters for really excellent presentations, very interesting work. And thanks obviously to all the attendees for your good questions. See you in 15 minutes.